Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the third of our trilogy of Clean Water Act webinars. Today, we will be talking about TMDLs and 9 key element plans. I was remarking to Bill earlier that of all the acronyms that you find in federal legislation, TMDL is one of my favorite because it's really long. And even when you hear what it is, it's hard to understand. So Bill Davis from River Alliance of Wisconsin will be helping us learn a little bit about TMDLs and 9 key element plans. And we'll also be joined by April Engel from River Network. I also want to shout out thanks to Rob Lee from Midwest Environmental Advocates for helping out with all of these sessions. And we'll be participating in the workshop that is coming up at the Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention. You can register for that at wisconsinwaterweek.org. Registration closes April 1st. It's $50. And we will be going into more depth on some of the subjects that we talked about here, and you can learn more about it there. I won't take up time talking about it now. And also just to mention that there are recordings of the previous two workshops available. I'll put links to those into the chat momentarily as soon as I stop talking. Just a few reminders. You probably all know this. You've been on Zoom enough now over the last 4 years, but please stay on mute at all times unless called upon. I think maybe I've got it locked off so that you should not be able to unmute yourself anyway. But that leaves you with a couple of ways to ask questions. You can type your question in the chat. And when we get to the question and answer session, especially if it remains a fairly small group, you be able to raise your hand and wait to be called upon, or we might just open things up so people can unmute themselves. We'll cover as many questions as can be answered in the time allows. We're slated to go to 5:30. We usually go over just a little bit. And just a reminder that the session is being recorded, so anything you say will be held for posterity. So I think that is all I have, and we are ready to bring in our first presenter, who's going to give us a little bit of a background on the Clean Water Act in general, and that is April Engel. April, I will stop sharing so that you can start putting yours in. April is River Network's advocacy director. She's worked for over 25 years, leading organizations, collaborating with partners to advance clean water policy, and supporting individuals and organizations who are working together to protect and strengthen their communities and the places they love. In her current role, April provides training, tools, and resources and facilitates peer-to-peer exchange on a number of water-related topics, including using the Clean Water Act to protect and restore the health of our waterways. And with that, I turn it over to April.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for making the time to be here for this third webinar in this series. It's been great to be with Wisconsin water advocates over the last couple of months, and really want to say thank you to River Alliance of Wisconsin, Midwest Environmental Advocates, and Wisconsin Lakes for hosting this series. So like Mike said, I'm April Engel. I'm the Advocacy Director at River Network. And to begin today's webinar, I'm going to share an overview of the Clean Water Act with you. I'm going to just briefly tell you about what its key components are and how those components work together to allow us to protect and restore our waterways. So quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with River Network, we've been around for over 30 years. And during that time, we've tried to fulfill a unique niche as the only national organization whose purpose is to connect and strengthen the network of water, justice, and river advocates who are working for water at the community, local, state, and regional levels all across our country. And we focus our work in 3 results areas: safe, affordable drinking water, healthy, resilient rivers, and climate resilient communities. And we support these goals through online, virtual, and in-person learning opportunities and trainings like this. Also through the development of resources and tools like the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual, which I'll be telling you about. We also convene peer-to-peer learning opportunities, similar to the one that we'll be doing at the workshop at the Wisconsin Rivers and Lakes Convention here in a couple of weeks. We provide one-on-one technical assistance and facilitation. We also do our own advocacy, and we also organize a national conference that's called River Rally, which registration is open for right now, and it's going to be in the Midwest in the Great Lakes area this year in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So if you're interested, we'd love to see you there. And at the center of all of this work is a focus on advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. So before we jump into talking about the Clean Water Act today, though, I'd love just the opportunity to get to know all of you a little bit more. So I want to invite you all to go to the chat and share your name and your organization, or the community or river, lake, watershed that brought you to this webinar today. Also, if you want to share how water pollution is impacting your community, watershed, or lake, would love to just know a little bit about that. And also, if you know what some of the sources of this pollution are, just so that we can just get to know each other and the issues that we're facing and working to address in our community. So I'll give everybody just a minute to share that in the chat, just so we all can get to know each other a little bit better. All right, great. It's great to see those of you who are sharing in the chat and learning more about the rivers and the lakes and ponds that you all are working to protect in your communities, the work that you're doing, volunteer stream monitoring. Impacts from runoff and erosion from being located in steep watershed topography. Work with local agencies, tribes, and volunteers to monitor water quality and restore habitat. Great. More work doing volunteer work on protecting and restoring streams. All right. Well, thank you all so much for continuing for sharing that information about who you are and where you work. And if you're still typing, I encourage you to do that, because it's just really helpful to know the work that y'all are doing and the issues you're facing, and the efforts that you have underway. So thank you. All right. So moving on, I want to tell you all just a little bit about the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual. And I'm going to do a high-level overview of the Clean Water Act and how it can be used by you, and really how the Clean Water Act is designed to be used by you to address water pollution problems that you may be experiencing in your watershed, your river, lake, or in your community. And so to begin, the information that I'm going to be sharing comes from the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual. And this is one of River Network's most long-standing resources. We released the first edition back in 1999, and then we did a second edition in 2005, and then we released the most recent edition in 2022 on the Clean Water Act's 50th anniversary. And Mike's going to put a link to the manual in the chat, so you can open it up and reference it as I go through this overview. Also, so you can bookmark it if you want to go back to it later, because we really hope that you'll find the manual useful on into the future. And the manual is really designed to be a how-to guide for how all of us can use the Clean Water Act to protect and improve the waters in our communities. And over the 20+ years since the first edition was published, literally thousands of people have used this manual to apply the Clean Water Act to pollution problems they're facing in their communities and in their watersheds. And we've also been able to use it to train over 12,000 water leaders across the US on how to use the Clean Water Act to ensure that our waters are clean and safe, and to track and influence how and also change the way the Clean Water Act is being implemented at the federal, state, and the local level. We also recently launched a new online self-paced training series based on the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual, and Mike's going to put a link to that in the chat also. And this training is a 9-part series. It's totally self-paced and self-directed, so you can access it at any time to learn the ins and outs of the Clean Water Act, understand each of the Act's key programs, and also learn about ways you can use the tools of the Clean Water Act, as well as your local knowledge from things like the water quality monitoring work that you're doing to advocate for your streams and rivers. So if you find that you're interested in learning more after today's workshop or sharing what you learn with a friend or a colleague, this would be a great place to send them as well. So let's get started. And let's get started by looking at the Clean Water Act vision and goals, which really sets the stage for everything else the Clean Water Act entails. In the chat, Mike's going to put a link to this graphic in case you want to refer back to it. And we're going to be using this graphic all the way through my overview. So, and also, if you want to follow along in the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, there are some page numbers to relevant pages in the manual. So if you want to go to those pages in the manual as we go along, you're welcome to do that. But to begin with the overview, the primary vision of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And it's important to remember that the Act is not just about identifying and correcting problems that we're experiencing. It's also about identifying good water quality where it exists and maintaining it. The Clean Water Act also set interim goals and national policies to guide us on the path towards achieving that lofty vision. So the first goal is to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into the navigable waters by 1985, a very lofty goal. The second goal is to achieve water quality, which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water by 1983, another lofty goal. And you may have heard that the Clean Water Act says our waters should be fishable and swimmable, and that comes from this second interim goal. And while the missed deadlines, you know, that these were originally, both of these goals were supposed to be achieved by the early to mid 80s, that might be discouraging. It also continues to serve as motivation to keep us working towards achieving them. It's also really important to understand which waters are protected by the Clean Water Act. The nation's waters, or the waters of the United States, often referred to by their acronym, which is WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S. These are the waters that are legally required to be restored and protected by the Clean Water Act. But how does the Act define a WOTUS? Answering this question has been a moving target since the early 2000s, when the U.S. Supreme Court made rulings, and then agencies made subsequent rules, and then those rules were repealed. All of that came into play, and Rob Lee with Midwest Environmental Advocates gave us great overviews of this in both of the previous webinars in January and February. So if you haven't seen those yet, be sure to check them out in links that Mike is going to share to those first two webinars. But for now, what's most important to know is this definition matters because it defines which waters are protected by the Clean Water Act, and that a Supreme Court decision in May of last year dealt a catastrophic blow to the definition of waters of the U.S., which has now been codified into a revised rule by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers. So next, water quality standards. These are the foundation of all of the Clean Water Act's other programs. So looking back up at the vision to achieve water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water, you'll see that this leads to the Water Quality Standards Program. Water quality standards are just that. They are measurable standards that are set for each water body to ensure the vision and goals of the act are met. The responsibility for this program typically and primarily rests at the state and tribal level, but the Federal Environmental Protection Agency does have oversight. And water quality standards have three main components. First, they identify how our waters are used, and these are called designated uses. Then they establish criteria to protect those uses, and these are called water quality criteria. And they also require waters to be protected from degradation, and this is called the anti-degradation policy. The Clean Water Act also requires regular public hearings to get feedback on the adequacy of water quality standards. And this process is called a triennial review because this process of gathering this feedback is required at least every 3 years. Next, to meet the goals of eliminating discharges of pollution and also to meet water quality standards, the Clean Water Act regulates the discharge of pollutants into our waterways. And this is another piece of the Clean Water Act that we focused on during the January and February webinars. So the Clean Water Act prohibits the dumping of pollution into water bodies unless that pollution is permitted. And to regulate the discharge of pollutants, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES for short, that permit program was established. So the Clean Water Act allows states and tribes and territories to administer these pollution discharge permits within their jurisdiction. And most states do administer their pollution discharge permits, but EPA has veto power if the permits don't meet the requirements of the law. And these pollution permits are effective for 5 years and are supposed to be reviewed, adjusted as necessary, and renewed at least every 5 years. However, many states are far behind in this process, and it is really common for permits to be extended for several years beyond their expiration without sufficient review. So this is a really important place where we can focus as advocates to see, what are these permits in our communities, and are they currently up to date? Next, in order to meet the goal of eliminating discharges of pollution and to meet water quality standards, the Clean Water Act also regulates dredging and filling of wetlands and waterways. And this program was set up to address pollution that goes into our nation's waters from activities that involve dredging in or filling in of waterways, and it requires permits for those activities, and these permits are known as Section 404 permits. And these permits are required of anyone who proposes an activity that would result in discharge of a point source discharge of dredged or fill material. So this would be things like dirt and mud into waters of the U.S. And Section 404 permits are commonly required for land development activities like construction of new shopping centers or housing developments, for the construction of building or the building of bridges or dams, and the development of new oil and gas pipelines. And in this case, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for issuing these permits. And regulating the dredging and filling of wetlands was a focus of the February webinar, so check that out. And especially if you want to learn more about additional protections that the state of Wisconsin has in place to protect wetlands from dredging and filling. And then next, in order to ensure that federal activities won't violate the Clean Water Act, Section 401 also gives states and some tribes, as well as some agencies, the authority to veto or place conditions on activities that require a federal license or a federal permit that may result in a discharge of pollution. So through Section 401, states and some tribes have the authority to review these federal permits and licenses that are issued by federal agencies to make sure that they're in compliance with water quality standards and any other state or tribal water quality requirements. So some examples of the types of federal permits and licenses that would require Section 401 review, those would be things like the 404 permits that we just talked about because they're written by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but also licenses and permits that are issued by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for things like building dams or for constructing oil and gas pipelines. Next, connecting back to the Clean Water Act's vision, in order to restore the integrity of the nation's waters, we also have to assess and report on the quality of waters to know if they're meeting water quality standards in the first place. So that's making sure that our waters, the designated uses are supported, that water quality criteria are being met. So the designated uses, that the water quality criteria are being met, and also that our waters aren't being degraded. And every state is required to determine the status of all their waters and compile all existing and readily available water quality data and information into a biennial report that's called the integrated report. And that report's due to EPA every 2 years. And the report must also include the state's determination of whether all designated uses are being supported, and a list that calls out which waters are not meeting standards. And this list is called the Impaired Waters List, and it's also called the Section 303D list, and that's the section of the Act that requires it. The piece of the Clean Water Act around restoring impaired waters is what we're going to focus on during today's webinar. And first, to meet the Act's goal to restore unhealthy waters after impaired waters are identified, the Clean Water Act requires water quality restoration plans to be developed to address the cause or causes of these impairments. And this is one piece of the puzzle that we're going to focus on in today's webinar. So to achieve the restoration of the nation's waters, the Clean Water Act spells out a two-step process. First, we have to identify the impairments that may be occurring in each water body. And then second, when we find impairments, we develop a plan to correct the impairments and restore the water body so that it does come back to meeting water quality standards. So water quality restoration plans are more commonly known as TMDLs, which is an acronym for Total Maximum Daily Load. And the term Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, actually refers to two things. First, a pollutant cap, or the total maximum daily load of a pollutant that a water body can receive and still meet water quality standards, and the water quality restoration plan that's developed to achieve that pollutant cap. So second, the Act also authorizes funding to assist government and non-governmental organizations and businesses to take action to meet the goals of the Act. And so two of those programs provide funds to address polluted runoff from what's called non-point sources of pollution. So this is pollution that can come from basically the landscape. These are often called 319 funds after the part of the Act that authorizes those funds. Also, there's funding to address improvements to clean water infrastructure, so things like wastewater treatment plants, through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Section 319 also requires states and tribes to prepare assessments of their non-point source pollution problems, develop management programs to address the problems identified in their assessments, and create a grant program to fund state and tribal programs for non-point source assessment and control. And these 319 funds for states are supposed to be evenly split between funding the state's non-point source management program activities, so things like planning, assessment, management, and statewide projects, as well as watershed-based projects. And Bill's going to talk about this and 9 key element plans, what they are and how they connect in his presentation next also. So finally, the Clean Water Act prioritizes public participation. Finally, the Clean Water Act prioritizes public participation in its very first pages. So every program that I've reviewed provides opportunities for public notice, input, or review, though the type of input or the type of participation differs across the different programs. So most Clean Water Act programs have a mechanism to challenge them if they're being unlawfully implemented through either administrative appeal or through the court. And then Section 505 of the Clean Water Act is devoted to a citizen suit provision that's similar to several other federal laws. And this provision allows individuals or organizations who may be adversely affected by certain actions or inactions to file a lawsuit to enforce the Clean Water Act under any of the following situations. So ongoing violations of a pollution discharge permit, or any discharges that are happening without a required permit. Also, 401 water quality certification, and then 404 dredge and fill permits, or when the EPA is not performing a mandatory duty. So all of the public input and review opportunities, these are a vital part of successful implementation of the Clean Water Act. And without it, it's really just, it's necessary for the Clean Water Act to work. And that's why you all are such an important part of successful Clean Water Act implementation. And so with that overview, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, April. And I'll give Bill a second to get his presentation set up as well and introduce him. By way of saying that Bill Davis is a senior legal analyst for the River Alliance of Wisconsin. He has over 30 years of experience. He works to advance new water policy and strategy during a critical time for Wisconsin's waters. Before joining the River Alliance, Bill worked on environmental policy at the state and regional level, including stints as executive director of Wisconsin's Environmental Decade, which you now know as Clean Wisconsin, Citizens for a Better Environment, and the State Environmental Leadership Program. He has an undergraduate degree in wildlife ecology and a law degree both from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Bill Davis.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for being here, and for Mike at Wisconsin Lakes and Rob at MEA and April at River Network. Couldn't have done this without all of them. As April said, I am going to be going over total maximum daily loads and 9 key element plans. A couple of forewarnings, I suppose. As with the other two topics, you could spend a lot of time on all of this. So this is not going to get into the weeds. It's going to be a little bit kind of high level. And I say that in no small part because if you come out of this and you have questions, one of the other reasons why our 4 organizations wanted to do this, and the other thing that you should very much take away from this whole series, is we're here to be resources for you guys. So if you do have questions at the end of this, feel free to get a hold of one or the other of us. As many of you have probably heard me say on other occasions, if we don't know the answer, we're probably going to know who does. So we can point you in the right directions. So for those of you who are not familiar with the River Alliance, we were formed in '93. Around 1,500 members all across the state. And we are an advocacy organization. Work on water policy. It's mostly my area. We have staff that also work on agricultural issues, non-point. We've worked on groundwater, invasive species, mining. Early on in our existence, we were heavily involved in hydro issues, and particularly dam removal and dam licensing. So that's kind of our area that we work in. Our mission is empowering people to protect and restore the waters of Wisconsin. And here's my contact information should you need to get a hold of me after this or at any time. So I'm gonna, the other thing I'm gonna try and do with this is, with my presentation, is kind of connect it in some key ways to the previous two uh, presentations that we did. So I'll go over a little bit of kind of overview and context, and then I'll touch on TMDLs and 9 key element plans and how I think they can best be used by you folks. I will also admit, by the way, that there's very likely people on this call that know a whole lot more about these things than I do, just because you've probably done your own 9 key element plan, and that in and of itself would give you more experience than I. But anyway, so a couple of things that I just kind of want to remind you of, because it came to me when I was putting together this presentation. In the early 2000s, I had the honor and good fortune to do some projects with a guy named Leon Billings, who may or may not be a name that's familiar with you guys or to you, but Leon was Senator Muskie's lead staff person in the late 60s and early 70s. Leon Billing literally wrote the original Clean Water Act. And so when I was doing this other project with him, we got into some side conversations because the Clean Water Act has done a tremendous amount of good things for the country. I think probably unlike my other 3 co-presenters, I actually predate the Clean Water Act. And I remember what the waters looked like before the Clean Water Act. And I grew up outside Washington, D.C., and as many of you have heard me say, you know, in the early part of my life, my parents wouldn't let me go into the Potomac River. And surely you would not go into the Potomac River if you had any sort of open cut or sore, because there's a really good chance that it would get infected. And while I wouldn't drink the Potomac River right now, I wouldn't be afraid of falling in it either. And that's in large part because of the Clean Water Act. But that said, 50 years on, it's also really clear that the way the Clean Water Act is right now, it can't entirely get us where we need to go. So we have to be very clever and try and get the maximum use out of it as possible, which is what we've been talking about in these webinars and encouraging you folks to do. And the reason why it can't get us where we want to go is because non-point pollution, agricultural non-point pollution, is exempt from the Clean Water Act. It's not regulated by the federal government. And that was one of the things that I kind of nattered at Leon about. And he got a little stern, because he just looked at me and flat out said, the reason that non-point is exempt is because the Clean Water Act would not have passed if it had been included. It was just the political reality at the time. It hinders us now, but we wouldn't have gotten all of the other advantages and all of the other progress if he had insisted and his boss had insisted on that. And we can not like that all we want, but just recognize that's why non-point is exempt. And the other thing, which I had not thought about, and this was one that he was actually more annoyed with, is the theory when they were passing the initial Clean Water Act was they knew that this was a monumental task that they were trying to achieve and setting the country on this course. And they knew that they didn't have all of the answers. So his assumption was that the Clean Water Act would be routinely amended and upgraded as we learned things, as we implemented it. And indeed, in its early history, that's what happened. So the numbers that you see here, when 72 is when what we call the Clean Water Act was passed. And then there were major updates to it in 1977, 1981, 1987, and 1990. And you will notice there are no numbers after that. It has not had a major upgrade for 34 years. And that's a problem. And so to some degree, it's not the act's fault. It's that, the political winds have not been such that we could improve and advance the Clean Water Act. So just for whatever it's worth, things to keep in mind. A couple of other things, because this becomes relevant, because there are some areas where Wisconsin has its own laws that fill in some of the gaps, and give us opportunities that frankly don't exist in other states. So one is the federal government, generally speaking, doesn't regulate groundwater. Yeah, I know there's wellhead protection in the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is kind of like that, but kind of groundwater, qua groundwater is not something that the Clean Water Act covers, and there's no other law really within the federal realm that regulates it in and of itself. Wisconsin does, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. And the other thing, and this gets to what April said, and it's very much, and Rob touched on this as well when he was talking about the Sackett decision, the definition of the waters of the United States, is the constitutional underpinning for the Clean Water Act is the Commerce Clause, which may sound weird to some of you, but it's really important to understand, because that's part of the reason why the Clean Water Act is limited in the way that it is. Commerce was tied to the navigable waters of the United States. So that's kind of why that is the way it is, and is why you can end up with some of the Supreme Court decisions that we did. And again, by contrast, Wisconsin, a lot of the authority for what we do is based on our own state constitution. So it allows us to do things that the feds might not be able to do. And again, so I'm saying all of that because TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, and 9 key element plans are quite different from the previous 2 webinars that we did, in that they are plans versus discussion of permits, which, as April said, are enforceable in a very significant way. TMDLs and 9 key element plans are not like that. They can both take a tremendous amount of time and energy, and they can do good things for you, but you want to make sure that you're using them correctly, because otherwise, quite frankly, you could end up wasting a lot of your time, or just, there may be better ways to use your time. So as April said, total maximum daily loads, they are required by the Clean Water Act for all waters that appear on a state's 303D list, impaired waters list. And the one thing that I can tell you about that list, at least here in Wisconsin, is it is growing, not shrinking. Last time I looked, we had 50 or more water bodies and water segments every 2 years to that list. So there is a backlog. We don't have TMDLs for all of the waters, because it's a long process. And again, that list is getting longer, not shorter. As April said, what the goal of a TMDL is to try and figure out a number for a parameter. So, and I'll get to that in a sec, that would bring that water body back into compliance with water quality standards. And then you develop compliance or an implementation plan to go along with that. The other thing about TMDLs is that all TMDLs are supposed to have just a 10-year time horizon. So I don't know, you may think of that as being incredibly slow or incredibly fast, depending on how much other work you do with this kind of stuff. But they have a 10-year time horizon. They are aimed at a particular parameter. They are aimed at whatever put the water body on the 303D list. So that's important to understand, because if you've got something like the Wisconsin River or one of the 3 Milwaukee rivers, there are probably lots of pollutants that are problematic. TMDL is not necessarily going to address multiple of those, and usually don't. They're usually just aimed at a specific parameter, like phosphorus. And by the way, I think a lot of people think of total maximum daily loads as being as almost exclusively applying to nutrients. They don't. They can happen. They can be done for toxics as well. That's not nearly as common, but there's nothing that prevents that from happening. And the other thing about a TMDL is who does them, who prepares them. It is mostly the DNR. I know occasionally regional planning commissions have done them, at least here. Most notably, if you're from Southeast Wisconsin, the SEWRPAC, Southeast Regional Planning Commission, Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, I know has done at least one. And once a TMDL is completed, it has to be reviewed and approved by EPA. So at its simplest, this is what a total maximum daily load is. This is the basic equation. So they look at the water body, and again, for a particular parameter, they try and determine what is the existing waste load. So what's coming from point sources, what's coming from non-point sources, which is load allocation, and they build in a margin of safety. And so they'll collect kind of what's going on now, and then based on that, they will also, and based on flow and a whole bunch of other specific geophysical parameters of the water body, they will then determine, okay, how much can go into the water and still have it achieve its water quality standards. But this is, so what comes out of a TMDL is, or the process is essentially this equation spelled out, obviously in great detail. And in Wisconsin, particularly for the load allocation, the non-point, they try and do that right up to edge of field. So you would have a, as specific as possible, an understanding of where pollution is coming from as it exists now, so you can target resources most effectively. Point sources are pretty easy because that they're going to have their permits that they can go off of to help them determine that. So this is, I don't know how clear this came out. This is just a screenshot. The web URL is at the bottom here from the DNR's website. It's the other thing, I will put a shout out to the DNR. If you want to know more about both TMDLs and 9 key element plans, Wisconsin DNR, their website's pretty good, explaining kind of what they are, what the opportunities are, what resources they have available. This is just a map to give you an idea of where the grayed out, which is probably the hardest to see, which is right here, are TMDLs that have been approved. The green is ones that are in the implementation phase, and the orange-ish is where they have current TMDLs that are under development. So one of the things just to notice about that is there are real significant swaths of the state where there's nothing. And I will guarantee it's not because there are no waters that are, not on the, let me rephrase this. There are waters that are on the 303D list that are in those white areas. The DNR, is resource strapped. So they try and be as strategic as possible in doing their TMDLs. The other thing, in April, there's another question I should have asked you. is you might know the answer to this. So the other thing that Wisconsin does, though, that I don't know if it's unique, but it's one of the ways they try and stretch their resources, is they do things like this whole big TMDL right down the middle here is one TMDL on the Wisconsin River. And so they try and take these giant water basins. And technically, that is a TMDL that is aimed at the Wisconsin River. But they use that process for as many, I don't know if they do it for all of them, but there are other stream segments in this area that are also in the 303D list. So while they did the TMDL for the Wisconsin River, they also did sub TMDLs for the other water bodies in that area that were on the 303D list. So it's a way of trying to, kind of knock off as many water bodies as they can and use the process as efficiently as possible. Because they had, particularly for something like this, the Wisconsin River, in terms of the data that they needed to collect it from the subwatersheds anyway in order to be able to do the work on the main stem of the Wisconsin. So they just took advantage of that. The other thing that Wisconsin does, which I'm not sure that other states do, is they will create what the DNR calls protective TMDLs. So for stream segments and water bodies, again, just using this Wisconsin River one as an example, for waters that are not on the 303D list, they will also determine what the TMDL is for those water bodies. So what you can't exceed. So it's a way of trying to get ahead of the game and trying to protect waters that are still high quality, or at least not violating their water quality standards. And this is where we will see if my technology works. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just wanted to bring this up. This is the final decision document for the Wisconsin River TMDL. And I just, oh shoot, it doesn't show up to you guys, does it? Can you see the
Yeah.
other document? Oh, we can?
Yep.
Okay,
Mhm.
is it scrolling?
Yep.
Oh, good, because it's not on mine. All right, cool. This is not unusual for what a TMDL is going to look like. They have got a ton of information in them because they have to. In order to be able to figure out what's going on, you're going to have this kind of land use description, exactly what is the problem that they are trying to fix. Where are they monitoring? How are they monitoring? Watershed information. This goes on. This is one of the things that TMDLs are very good at, is just generating a bunch of data and a bunch of information. It's also why they can take a long time to do. But you should think of these as resources. And even if you're on a smaller segment, going back and thinking of the map, if you're in an area that's within one of those bigger watersheds, if TMDL has been completed, or if there's an implementation plan for it, mine those for information, because they're likely very good sources for that. So the advantages of TMDL are they're required. Clean Water Act says you have to do them. So eventually they will get done. Like I said, in Wisconsin, we have a tendency to do fairly large basin scale ones, but they do sub watersheds at the same time, and they generate the protective water. So we try and get as much bang for the buck as you can. To me, the disadvantage is they can take a long time to complete and can be expensive because of particularly if they have to generate a lot of new data. In this day and age, I don't know how they might have a lot of existing data, so maybe it's cut down the time on that. But they can be expensive if you need to generate a lot of new information and data. The biggest thing about a TMDL to really understand is they're only really directly affect, or enforceable is probably not even the right word, which is why I put it in parentheses, point sources, because the Clean Water Act does not regulate agricultural pollution. So it gives you a whole bunch of great information, and they then have to put together an implementation plan, but they do not have, the federal government does not have a regulatory hook to force the non-point sources really to do anything. They have grant programs, which can be effective, but it's not at all like for a point source where there is a permit that you could bring a citizen suit to enforce. So if you are dealing with something like nutrient pollution or total suspended solids or other things where the source is probably heavily non-point, TMDLs can be a good source of, like I said, good source of information to mine, but don't go into them or don't look at them as being something that directly solves the problem. And they're only for the specific parameters that they were developed for, that put the water body on the 303D list. They're not necessarily for all of the issues that are affecting a water body. So so 9 key element plans. So this is from, just so you know, this is from the DNR website. They're watershed plans. So, right away, they're not necessarily tied to a specific parameter that are consistent with EPA's framework. And again, they're designed and intended to be much more holistic. And the real takeaway for this is, particularly for the DNR, they really view 9 key element plans as the major implementation plans for TMDLs. So it is very, very common to see 9 key element plans and TMDLs essentially nested. They don't have to be done that way, but it's from my discussions with DNR staff, that's kind of the way they think of them. So these are the reason they're called 9 key element plans is because here are the elements that have to be part of a 9 key element plan. And a lot of these are going to look very similar to what you would do if you were doing a total maximum daily load, where it really, starts to get different is down when you get into 7, 8, and 9, which is how are you actually going to try and implement this? The other thing that is very different about 9 key element plan versus TMDLs is anyone can do these pretty much. So it's not uncommon actually to have nonprofits, NGOs do it, municipalities could do one, tribes could do them. So you see, watershed groups could be the entity that does these. And that's very different. So if you're interested and if this fits with your broader plans, just know that this is something that is available to you folks. And this is a similar map of where there are 9 key element plans. And one of the things, and I couldn't figure out how to do an overlay, but as much as the DNR would like 9 key element plans to be implementation devices for their TMDLs, As you can kind of see from here, and if you remember the other map, there are TMDLs that cover this part of the state and kind of the southeast, but those two big ones in the central, there are a few 9K element plans, but not as many as I think they would like. But that's the current map off the DNR's website. And let's see if this one works. So can you guys now see the Eau Claire watershed one? Did that pop up?
Yes.
Okay. So as you can tell, the whole feel of these is a lot different. All the 9K element plans I've ever seen are way more friendly. And that's intentional. These are meant to be organizing tools as much as anything else. So they try and, most of the ones that I've seen, they try and make them a little bit more user-friendly, but they've got a lot of really useful information. And this kind of information on the coalition is huge. And I'm going to really, I will talk a lot about that in a minute. But that's the way that I would really think both about TMDLs, but particularly about 9K element plans. They're organizing tools as much as anything else. So they're very, very useful for helping you figure out who are your potential friends and maybe opposition in a particular watershed for the problems that you are trying to solve. And they very much should be used that way. But this just gives you an idea of like what a 9K element plan would look like. And again, they tend to be a little bit more user-friendly than most of the TMDLs that I've read through. Another thing that April had mentioned is various funding opportunities. Again, this is off the DNR's website, so you can find this and you can click on all of these programs. I'm not going to do that. But it's more just to point out that it's not just one funding program. There are a bunch of different programs that can fund different parts of work that are relevant to 9K element plans. However, in my career doing this kind of work, I have never known the DNR to have enough money to fund everything that they wanted to fund. So some of you may know this better than I, but all of the programs that I'm aware of that are on this list are competitive. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get it. And it's highly unlikely that through these programs that you would be able to generate all of the revenue that you would need to do all of the implementation that you would want to do. That's not to say that you should ignore these things. You shouldn't, but you're probably going to have to go above and beyond these sources, but they will, they certainly will get you started. And as you can see, there are some that will even give you the funding you need to create the plan, and then to some degree for implementing them. So there are resources out there. I would just be very clear-eyed about what it's likely going to take to really get a plan to the finish line, and think about how you're going to get there. So just to go over, some of the differences between TMDLs and 9K element plans. 9K element plans, all the ones that I'm aware of, are on a much smaller scale than the TMDLs, at least the way Wisconsin DNR does them. So they tend to be for more smaller watersheds. They can be done on any water body, doesn't have to be on the 303D list. Can be aimed at the entire watershed, not just a single parameter. They're not required by the Clean Water Act, unlike a TMDL. They also don't have the same time horizons. Matter of fact, to my knowledge, there is no statutory time horizon. So if you look on the DNR's website, you will find some 9K element plans that reach out to like 2045. So they're very different in that regard. They tend to be very much aimed at implementation and often used to complement a TMDL. So the concept of having nested plans. So that's what those are kind of Clean Water Act-y sort of things. But the other things being here in Wisconsin that are important as you think about whether you want to, if you're an NGO, whether you want to do a 9K element plan, for example, and you're thinking about how you would actually get the resources to fund it. Unlike the federal government, Wisconsin does regulate non-point kind of sorta. And the reason why I say kind of sorta, and most of the folks in this call probably know this, we have a concept called cost share, which is our non-point regulations are not mandatory unless you pay part of the cost. Now, if you do, technically, whoever receives that cost share then has to implement whatever the project is that you're asking them to do, buffer zones or whatever, and they have to maintain it. I will tell you from my own experience, and Rob and others can jump on me if they think I'm wrong, but Wisconsin doesn't do a very good job of enforcing the latter part of that. So there are people that get cost share that are supposed to maintain things, and often that doesn't happen, which is unfortunate. The other thing is Wisconsin does regulate groundwater. So we have some hooks there. If we have groundwater standards that you should think of in the context of whether this is something that you want to do and how that would play into implementing a 9K element plan or a TMDL for that matter. And again, just mentioned this before, the legal underpinning for Wisconsin's laws is different than the Clean Water Act. Ours tends to be grounded in either the public trust doctrine or in trying to avoid using a legal term. I can't think of a good way of doing this because it always sounds weird to most people if you're not familiar with it. So it's the states, not the federal government, that have what are called police powers. That has actually nothing to do with cops. It has to do with the concept that the states are the ones that actually are the frontline entity that has responsibility for public health and welfare. And so that's the other kind of underpinning of some of our laws, which again just can be useful in the way some things play out just to understand that. So all of that is to get to kind of the meat of this, which is, again, both TMDLs and 9K element plans, they're just that, they're plans. Plans can be useful if they are, designed in a way, and if you think about them in terms of how are you actually going to implement them? What are you going to do with them? How are you going to use them? So they are very much, in my mind, they are tools. They are not an end in and of themselves. And I've talked with many watershed groups who have done a 9K element plan, for example, but then they hadn't really thought about where they were going to get the resources to implement it. Either they thought the DNR would have that or whatever, and they ended up just sitting on a shelf because they hadn't thought about it in terms of, okay, how are you going to implement it? And so for me, kind of along those lines, I think the best way to think about these tools is, what is it that you are trying to achieve on your water body? And develop an overall campaign that lays out for you how you're going to get there. And there could very well be a role to play then for a 9K element plan. They can be really good. Some of the other bullet points that I've got there for developing or understanding information. They can be really good at understanding and identifying who the stakeholders are. Both friends and potential opposition. And similarly can be a really good framework for then, don't forget about point sources. These tools are aimed at, 9 key element plan is aimed at the whole watershed. TMDL is aimed, at a particular parameter. Point sources can be a really useful allies, frankly. If you've got, particularly if you've got point sources that have problems with phosphorus, and I won't go into this, but if you haven't heard about it, we have an adaptive management rule called NR217, which can be a very, very useful way of having point sources fund your non-point work. There are some other mechanisms that I'm not such a fan of in terms of trading that can do that as well, but again, it's another thing that's different about Wisconsin than other sorts of places. And just generally, a point source is not going to want to have to spend a whole lot of money ratcheting down its discharges to try and meet a TMDL if there's a cheaper way to do it, i.e. if there are ways of reducing the non-point. So, going through this process and thinking about it like a campaign, I think will very much help you avoid some of the potential pitfalls. And again, kind of getting to the end where you've got a plan, but no way to implement it. And these are just as I mentioned, Wisconsin DNR, I think, does a really good job on their website for both of these topics. And those are the links to those pages, which have a lot more specific information in them and such. That's what I have for you. So I wanted to leave a lot of time in case you guys have got questions or discussion. Yeah, so that's it for me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Bill. And yeah, we can open things up for questions now. You can type questions in the chat if you like, or just use the raise hand function, which is probably down in the bottom of your menu bar, depending on the Zoom you have. I was on Zoom on my iPad earlier today and realized that everything was on the top of my screen. I'd never seen that before. So, but somewhere there's a raise hand function. You can try that. Or as I said, type it in the chat. Questions for either Bill or for April.
I'll break the ice and ask a question, Bill.
Yeah.
Are the 9 key element plans at all tied to the state 319 program? And
yes.
do you have to do or do you have to have a 9 key element plan in order to get 319 funds?
I know that, and Mike, you might know the answer to this, or Rob. I don't know if you have to, but they very, very much encourage it. And some of the specific, the chart that I showed of those funding programs, those at least a couple of those are 319 funds. So that's the way they very much want to use their 319 to do that. And if there are folks on here who have done 9 key element plans, they also might be able to answer that. But I don't think it's exclusive. I think if you had a project that would address a non-point issue, you could still apply for it. But I think you would get more points if you had a 9 key element plan.
We got a few questions in the chat now. Janie asks, is it adaptive management plans that farmers' lands connected to waters are required to do?
No. So adaptive management plans came out of Wisconsin adopting a water quality standard for phosphorus. Phosphorus is a big problem. And everybody recognized when we were developing that plan that a lot of the sources of phosphorus are non-point. They're not exclusively. There are point sources that discharge phosphorus as well. But in a lot of places in the state, phosphorus is a big non-point program. And so the point sources in those discussions were actually interested in trying to figure out a way, again, phosphorus can be very, very expensive for a sewage treatment plant to completely take out. And it's annoying for them if the phosphorus that they're taking out, they're not actually contributing. It's actually it's basically in the source water that they've got. So what adaptive management is in Wisconsin, because that is a term that can be used in other ways in other places. But here in Wisconsin, when somebody's talking about adaptive management plan, they're talking about Rule NR 217, and it is a way for the point source to work with farmers upstream or any source of phosphorus upstream and provide funding for those sources to reduce their phosphorus load as a way of the point source meeting its permit obligations. And what makes it very, very different from like water pollution trading is this is built into the point source's permit and is therefore enforceable like any other parameter in a WPPT's permit. Kind of because of that, it's to some degree, quite frankly, and I say all of this because I had a hand in writing this, Truth in Advertising, along with a lot of other people. But I was involved in the passage of 217 back in 2010. The way it is played out, which doesn't surprise me, is it tends to be larger sewage treatment plants. So Madison has engaged in this. Green Bay has engaged in it because their permit is on the hook, and so they could be sued by somebody like Rob if they mess this up, and they don't like that. They tend to be very careful about it. It can be a very powerful tool, but yeah, anyway, I will shut up. I could go on for a long time about that, and we have other questions, but that's what I meant when I said adaptive management.
And we can come back to those if people have more questions. But speaking of phosphorus, there was a question. Could you explain why we have different P criteria for different types of waterways?
So this is where, again, Rob, you should jump in when I start getting this wrong. But so getting back to, or April, getting back to April's presentation, water quality criteria, man, can't talk anymore, are based on the designated use of the water. So the higher the quality water, and hence, the more, so if you've got a highest level of use would be like human drinking water, you're going to have a more stringent phosphorus standard for that water than for example, where the Madison sewage treatment plant discharges its effluent is not going to be used for the same sorts of things. So it's going to have a less restrictive phosphorus criteria. That would be my first and best guess. Not Rob, I don't know if you've got anything you want to, or April.
We're just going to leave you with that one, Bill.
Bill's all over it.
Kevin points out that 9 key plans are on a 10-year revision recertification cycle with the DNR and EPA.
Yeah, but they don't have to. So technically, a TMDL, you're supposed to be, you're supposed to have achieved your goal within 10 years. And it's that part that is not the case. So yeah, they want you to kind of check in and see if you're actually achieving things. But like I said, if you look on the DNR's website, you will see 9 key element plans that the time horizon for them is several decades.
Okay. And another question from Robert. TMDL sampling is from April through October. So how does it take into account early spring pollution during high runoff from snowmelt and no crops on the land?
It doesn't is the answer to that. And yeah, that's a question probably better posed to DNR folks. But the point there that I think you are highlighting is and this is it. So being a little bit more serious, if the DNR is doing a TMDL in your area, it is exactly those sorts of things that you want to look for, and you want to engage with the DNR and go, wait a second, this is not going to tell you what you need to know because you are missing a huge part of the problem. So for example, if you are on the upper Fox River flowing into Green Bay, you would know that 80% of all of the phosphorus that comes from the Fox River into Green Bay comes from 10 to 14 rain events from the 1st of May to the end of June. So kind of similarly, if you're not looking at that and you don't understand that when you're developing your TMDL, you're going to have a very, very hard time coming up with an implementation plan that's actually going to fix it. So that those, as you're going through those incredibly dense documents, it's those sorts of things that you guys really are in a great position to bring to light and to advocate with the DNR, because you know these water bodies and you know things like that. So bringing that knowledge and expertise is a place that you can engage with either a TMDL or a 9K element plan.
Do you think that that date range is just because that's when staff is generally doing field work? Is that a hard, like, could they do sampling in March if they wanted to?
Again, that's outside my immediate bailiwick. All I can tell you is from a technical point of view, yeah, you can sample whenever you want to sample.
Sure. Yeah.
There's nothing magic about that.
And I guess this year we don't have to worry about snowmelt. So
right.
A little gallows humor on that one.
Yeah, right.
Any other questions? I will actually take the if anybody just wants to ask a question, you can now unmute yourself. There. Otherwise, we can end things a little bit early today. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. I put in the chat some links to all of our organization's websites, and again, the links to the videos from the previous versions of this webinar. And the topics that were covered in them. So if you're interested, check those out. And again, if you want to register for the workshop at the Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention, which will be in Stevens Point, April 10th through the 12th, there's lots of programming. So I encourage you to check all of it out at Wisconsin Water Week, but you can register for this workshop in particular, but registration does close April 1st. So it's a little bit of an early registration close before the event. So if you want to go, get in on it now. And thanks to April and Bill and Rob and crew for doing these 3 webinars. This was a good time. Hope it was good information for everybody. And thanks all and have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks.